Welcome back to Hannity as we continue with reaction to all today's big stories and news. Author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Vengeance, former Speaker of the House, Fox News contributor, Newt Gingrich. So you have all of these cases, in some cases, these sexual harassment cases, mistreatment of people cases, and some people admit it. And then you have instances where they do not. Then we are hearing $15 million of taxpayer money was paid out by members of Congress. Shouldn't the American people, if they don't want to pay it themselves, shouldn't we know whose money, who's paying what, where, and how?
Sure. Look, I mean, this whole thing is, if you back out for a minute, this whole thing is crazy. It's a very good thing for us to explore. We're learning a lot of stuff that's a huge surprise. I don't see why, if it's a personal offense, I don't see why the taxpayers ought to pay a penny. And I think that that's something we ought to really look at carefully in terms of where have the taxpayers' money gone to cover up incidents like this. But I also want to take just a minute, Sean, and maybe this makes me, you know, an outlier or somebody who's out of touch with the times. I think there's an enormous difference between Harvey Weinstein, who clearly is a sexual predator and who clearly was exploiting his position of power, and President George H.W. Bush, who is in his 90s in a wheelchair. And I think we have all of these things coming together because of the infantile stupidity of our news media, as though they're all the same problem. Now, the topic is an important topic. And finding a way to have not just a workplace, but to have a community where people are not being harassed or being preyed upon, I think that's important. Finding what the rules ought to be, and I commend Speaker Paul Ryan, who immediately responded by talking about getting mandatory training in the House. I think Senator McConnell's taken the same position in the Senate. I think we deserve to know, the American people, who did the money get paid out to and who paid for it, and why is the taxpayer on the hook for any of this? So that part is a legitimate public policy question.
Well, if they wanted anonymity, they should have used their own dollars, right? If they wanted to make a deal, they should that should be their money, no?
Right, absolutely. And I think you're going to find the same things happening in corporations, where people are going to be very skeptical of the idea that you could spend the stockholders' money to cover up things that the stockholder didn't approve of you covering up. But I also think, I think what we've suddenly done is we have unearthed a lot more bad behavior and a lot more destructive behavior than anybody, certainly than I would have thought was going to happen, including some very positive people who I'm actually shocked to see showing up in some of these attacks.
What about the cases where there's no clear line, there's no Al Franken picture, and you don't know for sure? We saw what happened with the Duke lacrosse kids, and that's one of just a number of examples where so many in the media have been so wrong so often. There's a risk here that one allegation could destroy somebody, and it's not true, or it's far more nuanced than anybody wants to know.
Yeah, look, I think it's time, and I'm going to go straight out on a limb about this. We've had a very long tradition in America, going all the way back to the Boston Massacre in the 1770s, that you are innocent until proven guilty, and that you have the right of a presumption of innocence. And I think, again, if you have somebody like Harvey Weinstein, who now has so many names out there that it's almost inconceivable that he isn't guilty of a substantial amount of stuff, you start getting this, somebody remembered that 12 years ago they felt bad. Boy, I don't understand the standard that goes into that. And then how do you prove what really happened? And how do you prove whether or not somebody really meant to do something negative? And I do think we've got to take a deep breath here and not have the hysteria allow us to start destroying people randomly, so that you then set up targets where anybody who wants to can get even by suddenly remembering something that happened 20 years ago.
It gets hard, too, when there's politics in the equation, where, Clarence Thomas would be a case in point. Last-minute allegations thrown out there on the eve of a Senate hearing or on the eve of an election in October. Surprise, George W. Bush, the weekend before, that election with Al Gore, the DUI came out. So in the whole year and a half prior, nobody knew about that? That wasn't planned? That wasn't a last-minute October surprise to influence voters where somebody doesn't really have a chance to help themselves or prove they're grown beyond an instant like that?
Well, I think that's part of it. Part of it's manipulation of the public by liberal news media trying to make a point. Part of it is, I think, that you've got to look at some of these things and ask yourself, why are they coming up now? What's the evidence? And again, if it was it a situation that in fact was basically innocent, but is now subject to misinterpretation? When I see people who weren't particularly offended 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, but suddenly there's now this hysteria, and so they decide they're going to join the lynch mob, and they got their story to tell. I just think we as a country ought to take a deep breath and think carefully. And again, I say this, you know, whether it's about my wife, my two daughters, my granddaughter, for that matter, my grandson, because remember, you have many instances now of sexual harassment that involves men as well as women. So I think all of us want to protect the innocent, but we also have to remember that the innocent may be on both sides of that equation, and it's not automatically clear that a charge is the same as a conviction.
So Sarah Carter, who's going to join us later tonight, is now reporting that this FBI informant, this guy worked for over 4 years for the FBI and knew about Vladimir Putin, had established a network inside of the United States. Their goal was to crack into the uranium market. And he has documents, he has emails, he has firsthand experience, and apparently even tapes. Sarah Carter is referring to it as a treasure trove of information, proving, and that's where the bribery and the kickbacks and extortion and money laundering all took place, proving that that all happened. And yet that was 2009 before the approval of Uranium 1. It seems to now be cascading. The floodgates seem open. How far should this go? Is this something the Justice Department can handle? Is this special counsel area? Where do you think it should go?
Well, I mean, first of all, notice the infantilism of the American media today. The next story by somebody about something that may or may not have happened 12 years ago, as long as it's sexual, boy, that's going to be a big story. Here you've got an enormous historic story. You apparently have the head of Russia in a methodical project trying to gain access and influence over Bill and Hillary Clinton while she is Secretary of State, trying to get control of the American uranium market, willing to spend apparently well over $100 million. You have an FBI source who apparently was ignored deliberately by the Obama administration, who is out there saying, wait a second, guys, look at all this evidence. I don't understand how the House and Senate can avoid having in-depth weeks of hearings, taking this whole thing apart, subpoenaing everybody, making public all of the information about the Clinton Foundation, about Bill Clinton's personal earnings. I mean, how many different ways were the Clintons making money out of this? And does anybody really believe all this was innocent? I mean, I think it's astonishing. And by the way, it goes beyond the Clintons. It goes right to the Obama administration, to the corruption of the Justice Department, and to a level of problems that I think are truly historic.
All right, Mr. Speaker, appreciate you being with us. Thanks so much.